Ferguson. And we struck out. Obviously, when the events in Ferguson happened, I mean, there it is, our topic unfolding in front of, the national media. So we got there and tried to film it from our perspective. But that was very much the genesis of the project. And yes, I mean, as far as access, it was a nightmare the entire time. We kept building relationships with police departments, promising basically the only thing we had to offer, which was an authentic portrayal of whatever we did together. And I'll say that we absolutely came through on that word, but I think people are surprised to see what these police departments chose to show us. To me, it kind of speaks of how regular and routine SWAT deployment has actually become. I mean, just to give some context, when my father was on SWAT for 13 years, they did 29 search warrants total. And you contrast that with teams that we were going out with during the course of making this film, they're doing 3 to 4 times a day, over 200 times a year. So, we obviously see that there's a significant increase in how SWAT is used, and it's become a routine part of police work. After Ferguson, things got very difficult as far as access is concerned, but it's not unprecedented for people to go out with police departments. The TV show Cops has been doing it since 1989. I think that what people are responding to is our approach where we're not glorifying the police, but we're also not condemning the people that are being accused. We're there observing and allowing, hopefully, the audience to come to their own conclusion, just respecting the fact that audience members are coming with their own perceptions and experience. So we're really trying to get the camera in as many situations where we could just observe and let these things unfold. We kept thinking that we were going to be able to show the full range of the SWAT experience. I mean, clearly there's opportunities when this equipment is needed. I point people to the Pulse nightclub shooting, where they had in an armored vehicle there, they were able to puncture a hole in the side of the nightclub and free hostages. And so I kept thinking we'd be able to show an opportunity like this. However, statistically speaking, those situations are so rare. And what we kept finding is that these SWAT teams were being deployed for a routine basis, almost always for drugs. And I'll say that we did about half a dozen search warrants, never found anything for the entire time. So I was met with the challenge of saying, well, okay, I can't keep going on forever. I guess I have to show what we keep seeing, which is what's actually portrayed in the film. So I guess you could say we failed in the sense of giving the profession the full justice of showing how this can be used for good. However, what we show is what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And I thought that was important for audiences to see.
And what does your dad think of the film? Obviously, he's got some
perspective. There? No, I mean, I'll tell you, obviously, he likes what I do as a filmmaker. He's not a critic. He likes what I do. But I will say that it was very challenging for him to watch, seeing a profession that he put so much energy into and so much integrity behind, and seeing it evolved into something that's used for a routine basis. I think something that really pissed him off is, looking at Google Earth before hitting a house. I mean, I remember hearing him work for weeks and weeks and weeks to get a search warrant. And these guys, are just doing it on a routine basis. That team in South Carolina actually raided the wrong home six months later. Just ran in the wrong home. We're sitting there editing the footage, and this news comes across. And I'm like, I know why, because when we were with them, they're joking about, not entering the right home, which obviously there's tremendous stakes at hand when you're conducting yourself like that. So.
And what did you guys think of the film, coming from your backgrounds and perspectives?
Well, first I'd like to thank this film we made. It shows that there's much needed reform in policing. And when we look at Ferguson, the police department is an example of failed leadership by the department. I in Detroit managed crowd control, and so I've dealt with numerous protests. And what I'll tell you about most protest groups, even when they're angry, they're generally peaceful. Now, there may be agitators who attach themselves to the protest groups, but they can be monitored and controlled. And when the police department has an aggressive posture on a peaceful demonstration with armored vehicles, with police officers in riot attire, that's a problem. Now, we have to be prepared. Now, we have to be prepared, but there's a way to do that. And so the way Ferguson should have conducted their demonstrations is have uniformed police officers out there as a presence in normal police attire, monitoring the crowd's behavior. Off-site, close by, have those individuals who have the equipment in case the situation turns riotous. so they can move in and respond quickly and still be able to maintain order. But to have an attitude of combatant behavior from a police force, it only fuels the animosity, and it gives those agitators that I mentioned that are in the crowd, now they have a voice. Because you can hear them in the background, hey, you bring a tank to a peaceful protest? And another thing I want to mention, I don't want to take too much time, but this did disturb me. You know, again, being in the position that I am to manage these crowds. And you saw how the police department deployed that gas at that crowd. Terrible tactic. Number one, as the police chief in Chicago mentioned, when you deploy gas, it is a riot situation. That was a protest. So what? The crowd didn't move when the police department wanted them to move. When I have crowds that are locked into the street, we have an advantage. I can shut the street off, put uniformed persons on the east side of the street and reroute traffic. Most protest groups will last a couple hours and then they'll disperse. So for the police department to have an ego, as I'll call it, that I said move, now it's time to move, that's a problem. And when they deployed their gas, you don't deploy it into a crowd. For obvious reasons, those canisters can maim or kill persons. And you've seen children also in those crowds. And so again, this is an example of failed leadership by the Ferguson Police Department.
I found the documentary absolutely devastating. I am still processing what I just looked at. I thought it was tremendous. And in the same breath, I'm very disturbed by a society that can very quickly put millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars together to declare war on its own citizens. With all due respect, that the police have a very, very difficult job. I was horrified to hear, I'm a researcher, and I heard another researcher sit there in a very almost brazen way to say that, well, that's just the way it goes, that we can predict who's going to be what. I'm thinking of myself looking like I could have ended up in that red column, and I wouldn't be sitting here today. I'd say the same thing about my brother sitting in the audience. I still have memories because I'm a native son. I went to Detroit Central, and when the riot broke out in 1967 on July the 23rd, I am still reeling from seeing tanks and jeeps land on the Central High School complex with state police, National Guard, Detroit police, and as a 17-year-old or 12-year-old, you can't distinguish who is what, and you haven't done anything. In our house, the Taylor boys belong to the community. In our house, we were not allowed to riot. And yet, when our family dog got loose off the porch, and I went to get him, I still remember very clearly a big, bald-head, muscle state trooper cock his shotgun on me. And my mother had a heart attack on that porch. And I've never been in trouble. My brother and I, and all we were doing was getting our Cocker Spaniel. It wasn't a pit bull. And I still remember those scars. So one of the many things that I looked in this film, I saw those children in those houses and those raids that is overkill. I was laughing with Jewel earlier today from the Free Press that I once had a professor. He said to me, Taylor, we don't shoot butterflies with bullets. Talk about overkill and what those children are processing, and then you want to know why they grow up to hate the police. And at the same time, the police have a dickens of a job. I have to respect that. I understand that. But I found the film very, very disturbing. Artificial intelligence, it's not a movie, it's reality. It's beyond 1984. And I want to see what's going to happen a week from now. if there are certain groups that have made good on their promise that they will have a revolution, then I want to see what the SWAT teams do. I want to see who's going to answer that. And I'm very frightened by what I see, by all of the promotion that's going on.
Can you guys talk a little bit about what might be acceptable or excessive in terms of some of the military surplus, the 1033 items that have received, and also about technology? There's a big push right now for the body cameras. What's acceptable, appropriate, and what do we think is excessive from what you've seen, from what you deal with, and from what you know in your studies?
Well, I'll say, you know, you take a vehicle like the MRAP, which was only designed to withstand roadside bombs. It has a V-shaped hull, so when the roadside bomb goes out, the explosion goes outward, versus a Humvee, which was taking a lot of hits and killing a lot of people inside. I mean, like the gentleman says in the film, they roll over all the time. Well, because of posse comitatus, the constitutional provision that disallows the federal or the military on U.S. soil, that also includes training. So although giving this equipment, they couldn't train the officers how to use it, there's a story where there was a officer who was sent to a depot in California to go pick up one of these MRAPs. No one told them that the max speed is only 45 miles an hour because they're so big that it can become dangerous. He's going 75 miles an hour down the freeway. The friction alone explodes all four tires. He goes off, hits somebody coming in head on. You can't read this stuff. The guy was driving the new F-150, his own vehicle, off of a dealership lot, and the MRAP hits him, almost kills everyone, but destroys the vehicle. You know, whereas you have the Bearcat, which is a vehicle that was designed based on a Ford F1 or F-250 chassis. That's the other vehicle that's available. You can make a case for that. I mean, obviously, the Pulse nightclub, you need these vehicles, you know, when the time arises. I'm certainly not against officers being well-equipped. I want officers to be well-equipped. I just want them to use it for the stated intention. You know, every time we were training with officers, it was always like, well, we're preparing for ISIS or for the next Al-Qaeda attack. And then I'd say, okay, let's do a search warrant. And it was always not pulling the nicest fighter out of a sewer. It was always running in these homes for search warrants. So again, I don't know that it's, you know, you can villainize pieces of equipment. It's always like, how is it going to be used? And with no oversight, it's very hard to see how these things are actually being used. In terms of the surveillance technology, I wanted to make a point about, we'll come back to it when it comes back to me, please.
So I'm not a proponent of the MRAP. MRAP is too heavy for a city environment. As you mentioned, those vehicles have to be driven at a particular speed and they can't flip over. What we should have, what we do have in Detroit, are the Bear and the Bearcat. Those are law enforcement, industry standard armored vehicles. And we use them for our SWAT team only. And we deploy them for our armed barricaded gun situations. As an example, we had a barricaded gunman on Detroit's west side where there was a mentally disturbed man. He didn't have a phone in the home, so we had to use our Bearcat to negotiate. And so we were able to load our negotiators inside of the vehicle with our SWAT members and pull up in front of the home. And using our loudspeakers, we were able to get a rapport, a dialogue with the individual. Well, again, as I mentioned, he had a mental disturbance. He did use a shotgun and shot at the Bearcat twice. Luckily, none of the officers or negotiators were injured, but we do need that protective shell for negotiations, for distractions. So law enforcement needs vehicles, but should be used properly.
Well, here I go. I'm not so certain that I question if they're not really designed for intimidation. That when you see them arrive, whatever you're doing, if you're on the wrong side or if you're on the right side, you know that law enforcement means business. I don't think you're really concerned, not you personally, Commander, but I don't think you're really concerned about what little kids and Joe Blow, big-head professors or innocent neighborhoods feel about seeing those vehicles. Those vehicles send a message. It is an image not of protection for the police, which is a reality, but it is intimidating. It is, and I think that's how, again, many of the rank and file police may feel. We deserve this because we're going after the bad guys. I was very disturbed by Grossman. I said to you coming back, I had spoken in training programs with him before. He looked loomed out to me, I'm sorry. He was very disturbing because he was drawing a strong line against police officers need good leadership. He was giving the signals like wolf packs and what he was saying. I'm not using this book no more in my classes that I have for police officers. I'm serious. I thought he had crossed the line. I think he's been out there too long. I'm serious. There has to be a balance of humanity along with your enforcement, I think. Now, old school says that's not my job, but I think your job is a balance that you explain, and we have proven that. General Petraeus and others overseas has went out and had a balance of not only soldiering, but social workers. I know that's a bad word, but you're looking at young people and families and innocent women and so forth, so it's a balance. I know it's a different culture, but I think it's intimidation.
I just wanted to mention kind of the history on Dave Grossman. You know, he's been in law enforcement teaching for the last 18 years, but prior to that, he spent 25 years helping the military improve their kill ratio. So in World War II, the kill ratio was about 15 to 30%. It's very difficult to get humans to kill other humans because there's an ingrained self-preservation mechanism in all species where you'll see deer lock horn, but they'll gore another species. So he, by Vietnam, the kill ratio was improved to 90%, and how they did this was hiring people like Dave Grossman, who taught a process of desensitization training and pop-up target killing. So you basically teach killing to be a conditioned response, or a muscle memory essentially. And
brainwashing.
I'm sorry?
Brainwashing.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I think that if you're going to train soldiers like that, you're destroying a part of their humanity, so you better send them off to wars that are justified, because you're at the same time destroying someone's personal defense mechanism that prevents them from killing their own species. Well, Dave is pushing back a little bit on the film, and then he says, I'm preparing guys for the next 9/11. I say, okay, Dave, but listen, there's 63 million police-citizen interactions every single year, and if you're bringing the 9/11 to kill the terrorist mentality to those situations, people are going to die unnecessarily. And I think that it's very important to point out that the officer that killed Philando Castile, and that was the young man who we saw reaching for his wallet and getting shot 6 times, where we watched his life slip away via Facebook last July with a 4-month-old in the back seat. The officer that had shot him had attended one of Dave Grossman's seminars only 2 months prior. So to me, therein lies a significant training issue that you cannot be training people for the next 9/11 because the same officer sitting in that class didn't see the next 9/11 when they showed up to work the next day. They were writing traffic tickets, and they were responding to domestic violence. And most of the time when I'm doing ride-alongs with officers, it's a process of de-escalation, which is absolutely needed. And Grossman's philosophy absolutely doesn't provide any of that.
We're going to open it up to Q&A for a minute, but I did want to ask the commander if you wanted to comment about what you saw in the film regarding Grossman, because I know myself, having dealt with police for, over almost 2 decades now, that was kind of something that I found to be striking in the film. Can you talk a little bit before we...
Well, the first thing that captured my eye with Grossman is the capture that said military and law enforcement. And there should be a separation between military tactics, military mindset, and law enforcement. Law enforcement should be practicing community relations, de-escalation of force. And what Grossman is doing is, at least from what the footage I see here, is aggressive behavior by law enforcement, which contributes to the problem with community relationships.
And we'd like to open it up to Q&A, so anybody that has any questions for the panel, there is a mic. I see one right over there. No questions?
Tough crowd. No questions.
Not one? Okay. We have a
I
team.
have a question.
Yeah.
What about the Chicago police officer that didn't do anything and took a beating because she was afraid that society would condemn her for protecting herself? What do you say to that?
I don't have anything to say to that. I would say that, when you're met with ongoing challenges in the community, yeah, people start to second guess themselves. Dave Grossman said that the murder rate is going up across the country because officers are afraid to do their job. And I think that's a disrespect to a lot of the officers who do their job despite having pushback from the community, which is what we see across the board since Ferguson. Law enforcement has been getting a tremendous amount of pushback, yet officers go out every single day and face that. You know, so it's a very difficult place to be in as a police officer this day and age, absolutely. However, I'm not so sure that the murder rate is going up because officers are not doing their job. Like I said, I think that's pretty disrespectful to the officers that are doing their job on a day-to-day basis. You look at the murder rate, yeah, it's rising up. Well, also, home ownership right now in the United States is as low as it's been since 1965. What happened in 1967? Unrest, you know, protests. So there's many factors that go into crime, why crime is happening, why people choose to respond to crime, and why officers choose to shoot or don't shoot. There was an incident in West Virginia only 3-4 weeks ago where you had a military officer, ex-military officer, who had been trained in de-escalation. Yeah, he had spent time in Fallujah. He knew how to handle someone with a gun. He gets called out. It's a suicide by cop situation. Young black man, 20 years old, wants to die, wants the cop to shoot him. He has a gun by his side. The military officer who had been trained in de-escalation in the police uniform has his gun on him, says, "No, I'm not going to shoot you. I'm not going to kill you. You don't have to die. You don't have to die today." And he's truly being the hero that I think that we ask our police officers to be, putting himself out there, putting him in the role. Okay, 2 police officers come up behind the guy and shoot him in the back of the head and kill him. The officer that didn't fire got fired for dereliction of duty. He's no longer on the police force. To me, this is an individual that I would like to have on the police force. I hope the Detroit Police Department maybe hires him. This is someone that needs to be in the police force. So it's just mind-boggling to me that there's not provisions in law enforcement where those 2 other officers could have stepped down, and this guy could have been the hero that we're all asking our officers to be. You know, what is that saying? What are we incentivizing? I'm sure the next time, or maybe this woman that you're speaking of shows up and just shoots someone. So it's more complex than just someone choosing not to shoot. There's a lot to unpack here when we're looking at these incidences.
We have a line of folks. First question.
Hi, at first I just want to say thank you so much for making this film. I feel like it took a lot of courage to be out there and to do it and to try and just get all of us thinking about these issues. And so I have 2 questions. One, I was just wondering if you can talk about what you think is driving this militarization of the police, and 2, what can we do to kind of correct things?
You know, one thing I'll say is when we returned back from the search warrant where we seized the guy's $876, the commanding officer, the first thing he said was, "Did we seize anything? Did we seize anything?" And I think that, at least in that community, you know, a lot of these police departments don't have money to support themselves, so they resorted to ticketing citizens to raise revenue. And not just a normal amount, you could say, but in Ferguson, up to 30%. So you have a town right next to Ferguson called Jennings. They lost $1 million in sales tax revenue one year because they lost a shopping center. The very next year, they got $1 million more money from ticketing their citizens. So you're asking the cops to go out there and be the tax collectors for the community, treat the citizens like ATMs. And I think that when you're talking about seizing assets for underfunded department, you know, we've given them the tools of war and then given them a financial incentive to go use those tools. On paper, the idea of asset forfeiture makes a lot of sense. Someone has damaged your community, you take their assets and you put it in a general fund for the city to improve schools, roads, and things like that. That makes sense. However, the Fed stepped in a number of years ago and created the equitable sharing program. And they said, you know, if you include one federal agent on your task force, then 80% of the money goes back to your department and the feds get to keep 20%. So what has happened? Well, 2014 was the first year that American citizens had more money seized from them than they had taken through burglary. So $5.1 billion have been seized from American citizens in 2014, whereas $3.5 billion has been taken through burglary. So for me, you're not going to fix policing until you address why police departments are being asked to raise their operating budgets. It begs the question, why are communities failing? And then I get my answer as I go down to Texas and I drive for miles and I see these MRAPs, each costing the American people $1.2 million apiece. No wonder there's not any money to provide for our police departments, because we've spent it on wars that probably we shouldn't have ever gone into. So I think that is a huge driving force. And, you know, we need to address the fact that you cannot have the police departments raising their own operating budget. It automatically puts them at odds with their community.
Do the other panelists have any comments about that? Would you like to comment, either of you?
Sorry, and I was just wondering, can you talk about, I mean, what can we do to kind of get things back on track? Do you think that there are enough, like, concrete things that we can do individually or at community level?
I'll say that, recently, we can take a note from the Live Free or Die folks, the Concord, New Hampshire folks, where they actually failed by, speaking out that day. But I'm very thankful that they did, because who knows who's listening when you speak out, and I happen to be there to record it. And here we are 3 years later talking about their testimony. I'm sure they felt demoralized when they were just rubber stamped and didn't get their way. But I think that all changes in police work has to come from the community and the state level. You can't have federal top-down oversight across the board. And I think that no matter who becomes president, you're going to hear rumblings of privatizing the police, federalizing the police, which I feel is a wholly bad idea. And I think that you've seen communities speaking out and eventually getting their states to pass reforms to this asset forfeiture law. Whereas in New Hampshire now, or at least in California, they just voted on it 3 weeks ago, that it now requires a criminal conviction before seizing their assets. It sounds pretty basic and that we're just getting things back in line with the Constitution, but it's a huge step forward. Because that young man that had $876 taken from him, the burden of proof is on him. To say, because in civil asset forfeiture, your property is guilty until you prove it innocent. How does one do that? And it often costs maybe $3,000 to fight it in a court of law. So when I see states passing laws that require a criminal conviction before seizing their assets, that's a huge step in the right direction. And you're de-incentivizing police to have to go out and raise their money. So to me, it's a financial fix. I mean, all these other things, if you don't have citizens or police going out and raising money off their citizens, like in Jennings, up to the tune of $1 million, how many less police-citizen interactions are you going to have? How many of those are not going to turn violent or send someone to jail unnecessarily? So to me, it's a financial fix across the board, but we have to ask, how are we going to fund our cities that are failing? I think as a country, we have to rethink the entire approach.
Commander, do you have some thoughts, Carl?
Well, I think one of the things that's very confusing in our research we found nationally that right now we're confronted with marijuana is legal in some places and illegal in others. But with youth culture across the board, black, white, Asian, whatever, that youth culture looks at marijuana like they look at beer, or that it's not, even though it is illegally, it's a problem in that state. But it's inconsistent, and young people are on that social network, and they're talking to each other. And so that, to me, looked like, wow, what type of arrest was that? And then they broke out the windows and what were they saying? Oops, they didn't apologize. They didn't apologize about the windows. So there's this resentment that builds up. And I think that marijuana, in essence, did it deserve a SWAT team? Is at the end of the day.
Right, I know there was a lot of concerns about that particular scene with the SWAT team handling narcotics raid. And at least in Detroit, and I can't speak for other cities, but we have a narcotics unit. And the only time that the SWAT team would make an entry, we have a matrix system where each raid, you fill out a form, the perpetrator, the weapons that may be inside, and so on. If that level reaches a point where it's decided that a SWAT team would make the entry, then we would make it, but only on severe circumstances. Now, you did see the tactic with destroying the windows. That is something that has been used in law enforcement as a distractionary technique. As the officers enter, smash the windows for that brief moment in time. There's a confusion inside of the home that gives them a few seconds advantage, if you will. So that's what that's about.
I was saying, you came out with an old lady, an old man, and some kids. So I think it's bad public relations for law enforcement across the board.
Right, I think that what should have happened, and I don't know the intelligence that were gathered when they made that entry. It seems like in that small town, they should have known there were children inside, should have known the type of player they had, and if there was children inside, he could have been waited out. He's a young guy. Surveillance can wait him out and then catch him on the street and then bring him back into the house to conduct a search warrant. So it just depends on how the tactics and information came in from the department.
Thank you. Next question?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good evening. You guys talk a lot about how we need to remove some of these military tactics from the police force. How is that possible when we keep adding more military equipment as well as combat veterans to the force? And, oh crap, I had a second part, but I kind of lost it.
Well, I think, the combat veterans could be a good thing or a bad thing. There's a lot that come home that, like I said before, have this de-escalation training. I mean, I will say that we were also out with some officers in South Carolina that had told us they had been blown up in an NRAP and talked about their severe PTSD returning home. And now we're riding along with this individual fully armed, and I could tell the hypervigilance that he still maintained was probably going to be a problem with some of the circumstances going into. But that's not all military. A lot of military can handle it and are actually assets on the team because they actually know how to de-escalate. Yeah, you keep adding more equipment, but I think that, again, you need is a huge training issue that you need to address. And I think that, we've been able to show the film to police departments. The Criminal Justice College, the John Jay Criminal Justice College in New York, which is like the NYPD feeder school. We showed it for 300 students, and many of them were active duty law enforcement, and said, hey, listen, thanks for showing us this film. It reflects reality, it reflects areas that we need to reform. And I've seen a lot of officers who are kind of caught in the middle, who are trying to approach the department and speak about and sometimes whistleblow and reform, but are met with tremendous resistance. In New York, there was an officer who was a whistleblower, and he went out to a call 2 weeks later and called for backup, and none of his officers showed up. So, there's a group in law enforcement that are working hard to reform, so I hope that this film is providing a visual example that they can also use to bring back to their, a command staff and say, hey, these are some things that we need to look at. I mean, that's what, from my perspective, that I can do, but if someone else, please.
Yeah, so with proper oversight, we do need some of that equipment. I remind you back at the North Hollywood shootout in California, where the initial patrol officers responded to a bank robbery in progress. These individuals were heavily armed. The ammunition and the weapons of the officers who responded to that were outweighed by the armor and the high-powered weapons those guys had. In fact, the officers, or first responders, had to go to the nearest gun store to acquire higher-powered weapons to combat him as they waited on the SWAT team to arrive. So there is a need for our patrol officers, because they're the first ones that encounter these individuals, to have some type of access to high-powered weapons to meet those threats.
The commander actually talked about a huge thing, oversight. We saw in the meeting, there's no oversight in how and when they're going to be used. There was one state that required it, and that was Maryland, and that's only because the mayor of Berwyn Heights, Maryland, got his house raided by mistake, and his dog killed. So here you have this guy laying on the ground, handcuffed, saying, I'm the mayor, and they're like, get this guy to the psych ward, he thinks he's the mayor. And some officer went down and was like, shit, yeah, that's the mayor. So because it happened to someone in power, right, they moved this legislation through Maryland's state legislature pretty fast, and they started to require how, when, why, what's found every time a SWAT team was deployed. Well, it basically confirmed everyone's worst nightmares. 90% are for drug search warrants. Everything that we actually found anecdotally in the film is what they were finding. However, the ballot initiative came up in 2014, and it somehow fell off the ballot. So here we are back again with no reporting statistics on how and when, how this equipment is used. And I think even law enforcement, and when I've spoken to them, that they would appreciate the data because they're trying to improve and keep up community relations. And that data would be extremely helpful to analyze, are we doing too much? What are we finding? Is this really necessary? But there's none of that. So I think that's a huge area that you could point people to. Thanks for the question.
You mentioned training, and that jogged my second question. How is it that with all the training that our law enforcement officers get, they still get away with the time old classic, I feared for my life? If these people are so well armed, so heavily armored, and they have such great training, how are they able to kill people in such high-profile cases and get away with administrative leave with the excuse of, I feared for my life?
Well, here's how I answer that question. And again, we talk about law enforcement evolving. And that's the importance of having body cams distributed to officers out in the field. And what that body cam will do, in fact, if this is an officer who's a little more heavy-handed than others, the body cams can help to change behavior. On the contrast, the citizens who know that officers are equipped with body cams, it can also change their behavior. Officers get accused of a lot of different crimes while we're on duty. And depending on your perception of police, if you have a family who's had good encounters with police, then you tend to believe the officer's account of what happened. If you come up in a situation where you had negative encounters with police, then you choose not to or tend not to believe the law enforcement's story. So with body cameras, we can put a visual and we'll know exactly.
I remember what I was going to say earlier. It was regarding technology, but specifically about the body cameras. In fact, I think, after Ferguson, everyone was looking at it as like a one-size-fits-all, and I appreciate the actual sentiment that it can be an equalizer for both police and citizens. However, in 2014, when we were hanging out with all these technology companies, we realized that there was someone that already figured out how to do real-time facial recognition in all the body cameras using the squad car as a real-time hub back to the fusion center. So here you have a technology that could have been an equalizing playing field already being tipped in the hands of the police officers, because if you have 35,000 officers in New York where I live, and each one has a real-time facial recognition, well, you've then just created an absolute surveillance state. There was protest a couple weeks ago in Portland because when they signed the body camera law into law up there, the law stated that basically police officers were allowed to review the footage before writing their police report. So again, tipping the scales in the hands of the police department where it needs to be an equalizing force. The citizen makes their account, the police officer makes their account, and we have the body cameras to be used to validate the truth on both sides. And I think that when we look to body cameras, let's not just ask all of our officers to have body cameras, but let's be a little more sophisticated and understand that there's other things at stake that need to take place in order to keep it as an equalizing force rather than something that, again, just goes into the hands of those in power.
Thank you for your question.
Well, first I want to say congratulations on a great piece. That film was incredible. My next question is actually going to be a statement. For me, the film brought to life the book of Michelle Alexander's, The New Jim Crow. All of the chapters that I read in that book, the visuals that you gave in your film just really brought it to life for me. So I wanted to see if that was part of your research and if that influenced your movie at all.
If anyone hasn't read that book, it's phenomenal, and I think that it should be a part of required reading for every citizen in this country. Michelle Alexander book. I mean, it came to me. We were researching a lot of books. I read Killology by Dave Grossman, in fact, to get more research. But absolutely, I mean, it's a fantastic book. I mean, the film The 13th that came out really unpacked a lot of that. Also, a very important film on this topic. So certainly, that was a part of the background research. Yeah. That and Brian Stevenson, who you see appear during the 21st Century Task Force meeting, required reading for anyone who's interested in this topic. Brian Stevenson is just a tremendous individual who really gets it, and him and Michelle Alexander, I think, are great people to look for, for this topic, certainly.
Well, I appreciate the reference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to commend Commander Barron for representing your Detroit Police Department. With this panel and with this the film as well, it is a very difficult life that they put the police departments in. And I'll start off with a comment before I ask the question. The one thing I think we do here in Detroit that a lot of other departments, I'm sorry, I'm going to cover that we do here in Detroit that a lot of other departments probably need to do as well is we have a Board of Police Commissioners, which is a civilian oversight. We also have a great relationship with our civilian population. Now, anytime that could change, but I guess I would encourage anyone to go to your local precinct within the city. Try and get involved. Command officers, we want to hear what you have to say. And literally, we want to make sure our officers don't get in trouble. And we do not want to be portrayed like we see the officers portrayed in this film. And I think this film, it actually puts a transparency on something. A lot of command officers, and I think leadership, the commander said that leadership is the most important thing, and accountability. And I think this should be required. viewing for any law enforcement officer, senior and current. My question is for the, I guess it was referring to Grossman. I guess Grossman, his studies were more conventional tactics. You see the conventional tactics, which is force on force, which means I'm coming to you and I'm fighting you face to face, my force to your force. That's the conventional attack, as opposed to the insurgency and counterinsurgency methods. Was there any questioning or was there any look into the counterinsurgency methodology that they use in the military? It's something that police departments use, sort of, if you look at the community policing and what counterinsurgency is. I don't know if anybody on the panel understands it, but it's a military doctrine that actually puts the soldiers within that village, that town, and they become part of the town. They support the people, they learn the people, and I think that's what we need to look at going forward. And it's a method that could be incorporated from the military as well. But I just think that's something that could be looked at as well when we do things like this.
Yeah, it's interesting when you hear that, you know, exactly what you said. I mean, our efforts in Iraq were essentially win the hearts and minds, put people, it was basically a community policing model. So as we're community policing Iraq, you know, we're militarizing and changing our approach domestically. It was an interesting contrast. Yeah, to your point, very much so. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up quickly. We have 3 more questions, if we can move to them pretty quickly.
Hi, I just wanted to say first that I thought the documentary was great. I learned a lot from it. My question is, do we think the idea of police reform is mythical? Because Ta-Nehisi Coates writes that we employ the police to do everything to handle all our social problems, for everything. So it's the 3rd most trusted institution in America. So is it more about reforming the system or restructuring the system as a whole?
I mean, one thing that keeps popping up for me is the fact, you know, police officers were meant to protect and serve the society, not fix the society when it's absolutely failing. You know, I think that there's a lot of things that we need to do, to fix society so that we can put police officers in a position to actually protect and serve that society. And I think that they're oftentimes, I mean, just from my anecdotal 3 years of experience riding along, they're being asked to, you know, basically address the fact that we don't have any mental health services anymore. They unloaded all the mental health hospitals, and now these officers have to go out and be the mental health professional. They're not equipped for that. They're not, you know, trained for all of that. So, you know, again, we have to, you know, take a little bit of responsibility holistically as a country and get back to fixing our communities. So then you can have police officers, because police officers from the community, be healthy individuals that are going to, you know, be liaisons involved in the community, like the gentleman was saying. So I don't think it's beyond reform, but I think that the police reform that we need to make are very specific to policing, and we need to separate the fact that we can't keep asking them to fix society.
I think you have to do both, reform and restructure. I think that in this state, you have to look at the fact it's not law enforcement that is the #1 item for fiscal, it is prisons. And so we're dumping mental health and everything into prisons. We're not giving the money to police, and I'm not knocking the corrections personnel, but our priority is not education, it's not social services, and it's not police. We're putting all our money into locking people up, and then when they return, we're surprised that they're still, or even worse than they were before.
Great.
And to your point, we spend a lot of time dealing with issues of individuals with mental disturbance. A lot of our barricaded gunmen was an individual with mental disturbance. So, you know, reform is an issue. This film brings out some reforms we can make in policing, but we are tasked with a lot of different issues. When the officer's on the street, he's been yelled at, for whether his garbage not being picked up, whether it's somebody's son or daughter has an issue, relationship matters, and we find ourselves doing a lot of counseling. And as you mentioned, we don't have the level of training. We have some classes in there, psychological behavior, but not the level of training to resolve all those issues.
Great. We have 2 final questions. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. Just a little bit more on the mic. Sorry. Thanks. Thank you for screening the film. It was not anything I had never heard of before, but it was terrible nonetheless. I'm trying to think of words, and I only have like one question. I had two, but you talked about mental health, all three of you, so that was one thing I was curious about. I have a question for you, Craig, about your equipment that you used when you were shooting as well, and when you were doing the shoots that were on the ground with the police officers, like how many cameras did you have, and what kind of equipment did you use when you were filming?
Sure. So a question about the filmmaking process. Essentially, I shot basically every frame except for Obama in federal prison. It was just one camera, myself and then Laura Hartrick, the producer, who was either keeping a lookout or interviewing or just involved in general. I mean, I was a little bit concerned. I usually would have her record a separate audio channel, but in Ferguson, with these officers who were not trained, and when tear gas was going off, I was afraid that a camera microphone with a pistol grip, which is what it's called, looked like a gun, and we could get ourselves in more danger than we'd ever want to. So, no, I mean, the filmmaking was essentially just myself with the camera, and I had a really amazing editor get a hold of me when I was early in my career and basically said, you know, when you're seeing a scene, don't just point the camera everywhere, like tell me your perspective through the piece. And that's what I keep trying to do, is try to pick my perspective or my understanding of how I'm experiencing the scene and just offer one perspective of that, so that at least there's a consistent thought there versus all this disjointed footage. So it was, you know, just basically, you know, the two, Laura and I, for the entire process, and myself shooting. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. We have one final question, and then we have to wrap up. Last question of the night.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm with Professor Taylor. I'm just still processing all this. This is an amazing piece. And so after I ask my question, just say when this will be available, actually. But most police calls don't involve the kind of high-intensity interaction that we saw in the film. So in terms of the training that you did see, I don't know as much about Grossman, but I do know about this guy Lewinsky from the Force Sciences Institute. It's kind of the same idea, although it's a little bit more kind of white-collar sort of state. But I guess my question is, right now, the crisis intervention teams are considered to be a best practice. The 21st Century Task Force said that. How much of that kind of stuff did you see? Because now police departments are saying, we don't have money for crisis intervention training. They seem to have a lot of money to send people to these trainings for, like, Grossman, Lewinsky. Who's paying for that? Are these just SWAT officers? I mean, it sounds like crisis intervention training, there's nothing there, but for this kind of stuff there is. So did you see a range of that? You see that there's de-escalation training?
Well, you know, we've actually partnered, so we've developed an educational guide for law enforcement specifically that I think we're going to be able to do a police department, police academy tour. Maybe you'll have us in Detroit, sir, to show the film and get it in front of officers. We partner with people who are actually working on de-escalation training, and actually very, very sound modules that basically, you know, have scientific research from multiple universities for the last 7 years showing how it's actually way more effective than this other, you know, shoot first, ask questions later approach. So like I said, do see a wave of officers who are working hard to try to reform their department, but again, you know, it gets a lot of pushback. So,
but is that part of the normal training? Is this part of the normal training?
Oh, the Grossman philosophy?
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, you know, if you look at his calendar, he's booked, you know, 250 days next year. So someone is, yeah, and it's, you know, I will say though that after Philando Castile was killed, and someone researched the officer's training record, and realized that Dave Grossman was one of his instructors only a couple months prior. Sheriff Laurie Smith in California heard about that and canceled the training because people protested and said, we don't want this guy training our law enforcement, and she ended up canceling training, stating that I think this individual would make my officers more prone to use deadly force. So hopefully we can get this into police academies and department and get to the young minds before Dave Grossman does. We shall see.
And where will it be available?
So as far as the film being available, please keep in touch. It's donotresistfilm.com. There's a website, obviously an email website. You know, we keep you informed like that. Also on Twitter, Facebook, Do Not Resist Film. But in a few short weeks, it'll be available on iTunes, Google Play, Amazon, and then January, excuse me, it will be on Amazon Prime. So January 1st, anyone who has Prime can watch it for free. 8 months later, it will be on PBS on the POV program.
I teach policing society class. I like to use it.
Yeah, we have an educational rollout now, so get in touch and we'll bring it to your department. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. I see so many faces that I recognize. I really appreciate coming out and supporting the film, truly. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. I want to thank our panel, and I want to thank you guys, Craig, Commander, Carl. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I appreciate it.